He had always loved music. Even as a little boy, he would tap his fingers on tables, hum melodies while walking to school, and make up songs about the small things he saw every day. The sounds of the world fascinated him: birds chirping in the morning, the rhythmic sound of rain on rooftops, the way wind whispered through the trees. To him, everything had a beat, a rhythm, a story waiting to be turned into music, but life wasn't always easy. He grew up in a small, crowded neighborhood where dreams often felt too big for the narrow streets and cramped houses. Families were struggling to make ends meet, and most people were focused on surviving, not creating art. Music wasn't considered practical. "It won't feed you," neighbors would say. "Better stick to something safe." Yet, no matter how many times he heard those words, the boy couldn't ignore the pull of his music. Every day after school, he would find a quiet corner somewhere, a spot where he could sit and play. Sometimes it was in the back of the small community center, where the walls were lined with peeling posters of old concerts. Sometimes it was in a tiny courtyard behind his apartment building, where the evening breeze carried his notes across the neighborhood. People passing by would stop for a moment, listen and smile. But just as often, someone would shake their head and mutter, "No one's going to take you seriously." His instruments were nothing fancy. A second-hand keyboard with some missing keys, a guitar that had a few strings that never stayed in tune, and a small drum kit that had been pieced together over time. But to him, they were treasures. Every scratch, every dent, every imperfection had a story. And through them, he learned patience, creativity, and resilience. School wasn't easy either. Some teachers didn't understand his passion. "Focus on your grades," they would insist. "Music won't get you anywhere." He tried to follow their advice, but it felt like ignoring a part of himself. Even when he sat in class, his mind wandered to rhythms and melodies. Sometimes he would quietly tap a pen on his notebook, creating little beats no one else could hear. Other times he would hum softly, hoping no one would notice, letting the music fill the silence of the classroom. Despite all the discouragement, he found encouragement in small places. His younger neighbor, a quiet child who often played alone, would sometimes join him in the courtyard, clapping along or tapping on an old tin can as a drum. A shopkeeper who always seemed grumpy would nod his head to the rhythm as he walked past. Even the stray cats in the alleyways seemed to pause and listen when he played at sunset. These little moments reminded him that music mattered, even if the world didn't always say it out loud. Then one day, everything changed. A local festival was coming to town, an event that drew crowds from all around the city. It was the kind of festival where famous performers came to play, but they also left room for local talent. He had dreamed of performing in front of a crowd like this for years. When he finally heard about it, his heart raced with excitement and fear. Could he really do it? Could he make all those people stop and listen to him? He decided to try. With trembling hands, he signed up for a small slot, just enough to get a chance on stage. The festival organizers were polite but cautious. "We're not sure about letting a young kid perform loudly," one of them said. "Keep it quiet. Don't distract the audience." The words stung. Quiet? He thought. How can my music be quiet? It's not just sound, it's life. But he agreed anyway. He promised to be careful, to follow their instructions. Deep down, though, he knew that once he stepped on that stage, something inside him would take over. Music wasn't something he could control, it was something that flowed through him, and when it did, it had to be heard. The days leading up to the festival were intense. He practiced relentlessly, sometimes until his fingers ached and his voice felt hoarse. He experimented with different sounds, different ways to tell a story through music. He played soft notes, fast beats, slow melodies, and everything in between. He wanted to be ready, not just to perform, but to connect. To make people feel something they hadn't expected. At home, his family watched quietly. They weren't sure what to think. His parents wanted him to focus on more practical things, but they also saw the light in his eyes when he played. They had seen him struggle, seen him pour hours of effort into something intangible, and they realized that maybe, just maybe, this passion was a part of who he was. They didn't say much, but sometimes they would peek into the room, smile faintly, and nod as if giving silent encouragement. The morning of the festival arrived. The air was buzzing with excitement. Stalls lined the streets, vendors shouted their wares, children ran with balloons, and everywhere there were people chatting, laughing, and taking in the sights, backstage. He felt a storm of emotions, fear, anticipation, doubt, and hope all tangled together. He held his guitar in his hands, ran his fingers over the strings, and tried to calm his racing heart. The festival coordinator approached, giving him a last warning. "Remember, keep it quiet. Don't upset the other performers. Don't get too carried away." The words were heavy, almost like a weight pressing on his chest. But as he looked out at the sea of people waiting to be entertained, he made a quiet promise to himself. "I will not hide. I will play my music and I will be heard." When it was finally his turn, he walked onto the stage. The bright lights made the audience blur into a sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and started to play. At first, the notes were soft, careful, almost like testing the waters. He could hear the chatter of the crowd, the rustle of movements, the distant sound of someone dropping a bottle. It was hard to focus, but he closed his eyes and let the music take over. Slowly, something magical began to happen. The notes grew bolder, richer, more confident. He didn't hold back. Every chord, every beat, every melody told a story of struggle, of late nights practicing alone, of doubters who said he couldn't do it, of small victories nobody else noticed. The music seemed to reach out to the crowd, pulling them in, making them pause, listen, and feel. People started to quiet down. Some stopped mid-conversation. Some leaned forward, curious, trying to catch every sound. The skeptical faces in the front row softened. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the festival organizers looked surprised, exchanging glances as they realized that the boy on stage was doing something extraordinary. He played with his heart wide open, forgetting everything else, the warnings, the fear, even himself. The music wasn't just notes anymore. It was a story, a message, a voice that refused to be silenced. Every person in the audience could feel it, even if they didn't fully understand where it was coming from. There was power in the music, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any words could. As the final notes lingered in the air, a hush fell over the crowd. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped to listen. And then, slowly, the applause began. At first, a few hands clapped, then more, then the entire crowd erupted into cheers and whistles. The boy stood on the stage, chest heaving, a wide, stunned smile spreading across his face. He had done it. He had played his heart out, and the world had listened. For the first time in his life, he felt completely seen. Not for who people thought he should be, not for what was considered practical, not for what others told him to do. He had been himself, fully and completely, and the music had carried him beyond fear, doubt, and silence. After the performance, people came up to him, praising him, shaking his hand, asking questions about his music. Some admitted they had doubted him, but now they were inspired. Others simply smiled and nodded, saying nothing, letting the music speak for him. Even the festival coordinator, who had warned him to stay quiet, came over with a rare smile and said, "I didn't expect that. That was incredible." That day he realized something important. Life would always try to tell him to stay quiet, to play small, to settle for less. But if he trusted his voice, trusted his music, he could move mountains. The world might not always understand, and the crowd might not always cheer, but there was power in expressing his truth and sharing what was inside him. And from that day forward, he knew he would never play quietly again, not because it was loud, but because it was real, because it was him. After his performance, the boy didn't have time to relax. The energy of the crowd, the applause, the faces filled with all of it was still buzzing in his mind. He could hardly believe what had just happened. It was one thing to imagine people listening to his music, but it was another to actually feel it, to see it reflected in their eyes, and hear it in their claps and cheers. That moment was electric, alive, and entirely unforgettable. Backstage, he tried to calm himself, but his hands trembled, his heart raced, and his mind was spinning. People were approaching him from all sides, offering congratulations, asking questions, and praising the way he had played. Some were fellow musicians, nodding in silent approval, while others were complete strangers, amazed that someone so young could hold the stage with such presence. He could barely find words to respond. Most of the time he simply smiled, thanked them, and let the feeling sink in, but not everyone was smiling. Among the crowd of admirers he noticed a few skeptical faces, the festival staff, some of the older musicians who had been performing for years. One of the coordinators approached, arms crossed, trying to hide their surprise. "You did well," they said, the words hesitant, almost grudging. "But remember, that stage is not always for experimentation. Sometimes you need to follow instructions." For a moment, he felt a pang of disappointment. Did they mean he had gone too far? Had he been reckless? But then he realized something. His music wasn't about following instructions. It was about expressing himself, about reaching people in a way words never could. And judging by the applause, the smiles, the quiet faces of awe in the crowd, he had done exactly that. The next few hours were a blur. People kept coming, shaking his hand, asking for tips, or just wanting to talk about how his music made them feel. A few journalists and bloggers asked to record short interviews, wanting to know where his talent came from and how he practiced. He explained simply, honestly, without exaggeration. He told them about the small, cramped apartment, the old keyboard, the late-night practice sessions, the joy of discovering rhythms in everyday life. He wanted them to understand that music wasn't just an escape, it was a part of him, something he couldn't turn off even if he tried. Meanwhile, the other performers watched. Some were clearly impressed, but a few were still skeptical, whispering among themselves. "Who does he think he is?" one muttered. "He's just a kid." The boy overheard it but didn't react. He knew there would always be doubters, people who didn't understand, people who wanted to pull him down. What mattered was that he had spoken through his music, and it had reached people in a way words never could. As the festival continued, he found a quiet corner backstage to reflect. He thought about everything that had led him to this moment, the hours of practice, the discouragement from others, the late nights and early mornings, the small victories that no one else had seen. All of it had built up to this moment. And now, standing on the threshold of something bigger than he had imagined, he felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. Pride because he had proven something to himself. Nervousness because he realized this was only the beginning. That night, after the festival ended and the crowds had dispersed, he walked through the empty streets, the sounds of the city quiet around him. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a calm sense of purpose. He thought about the people he had reached, the faces he had seen, and the impact of a few minutes of music. It was humbling, but it also fueled something deep inside him, a desire to keep going, to push further, to explore what his music could really do. He returned home exhausted but exhilarated. The small apartment felt different somehow, almost alive with the memory of the day. He set his instruments in their usual spots, ran his fingers over the keys and strings, and began to play again. This time, he didn't worry about being quiet or following rules. He played for himself, for the joy of it, for the way it made him feel alive. The music filled the tiny room, echoing against the walls, reminding him why he had started this journey in the first place. Over the next few days, the festival's impact continued to unfold. People talked about him everywhere, the streets, the shops, the local cafes. Some described the performance as magical, others as unexpected, but everyone seemed to agree that there was something special about the way he played. For the first time, he felt seen not just as a child with a hobby, but as a musician, as someone whose voice mattered. Messages started coming in. A local music teacher offered to give him extra lessons. A small music store offered to lend him a better instrument. Even other performers reached out, wanting to collaborate or simply share encouragement. He felt a warmth in his chest that he had never felt before, the sense that people believed in him, not just for his skill, but for the courage he had shown in being himself. But with recognition came pressure. Friends at school were curious, some impressed, some jealous. Teachers began asking him questions about the festival, expecting him to explain everything. And he had to learn how to balance it all: the excitement, the expectations, the desire to keep creating without letting the pressure overwhelm him. It wasn't easy. Some days he felt exhausted, doubting whether he could keep up. Other days he felt invincible, ready to take on any challenge. One afternoon, he received an invitation to perform at another event, this one bigger than the last. His heart leapt, but so did his anxiety. Could he really do it again? Could he recreate the magic, or would the crowd be unimpressed this time? He thought back to the festival, remembered the way he had felt on stage, the way the music had flowed naturally, and realized something important. He didn't need to recreate magic, he just needed to be himself. That was enough. That had always been enough. As he prepared for the new opportunity, he also began teaching himself more about music. He watched videos, read books, experimented with new techniques. Every day he discovered something new, a chord that felt right, a rhythm that excited him, a melody that brought tears to his eyes. Music was no longer just a hobby. It was becoming a language, a way to communicate without words, a bridge between him and the world. One evening, while practicing a new composition, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered near the window, quietly listening. They didn't say much, just nodded and smiled as he played. It reminded him of the courtyard where he had first practiced years ago, when the world seemed indifferent, and yet a few people had still listened. That memory made him smile. It reminded him that no matter how small the audience, music had power. Even a few hearts touched by a melody could make all the effort worthwhile. His confidence began to grow, but so did his understanding of responsibility. Music could move people, inspire them, and make them feel things they couldn't put into words. It could also challenge them, surprise them, or even confront their expectations. He realized that every time he played, he had a choice to simply entertain or to communicate something real. And he wanted it to be real. A week later, the day of the new event arrived. It wasn't as crowded as the festival, but the stakes felt higher. The audience was diverse, some familiar with his performance, others there by chance. The organizers reminded him, as always, to stay controlled, to keep it simple. He took a deep breath, remembering the festival, remembering the way his music had silenced doubt, fear, and skepticism. He smiled to himself, knowing that the rules of the stage were just guidelines, not boundaries. When he walked on stage, something shifted. The nerves didn't disappear, they never did, but he embraced them, let them fuel his playing. The first notes were soft, careful, as he tested the room, but soon, like a river breaking through a dam, the music poured out freely. Every chord told a story, every beat echoed a heartbeat. Every melody carried the weight of years of practice, hope, and resilience. The audience responded slowly at first. A few heads turning, a few people stopping to listen. But as the music built, something extraordinary happened. Conversations stopped, laughter faded, even the air seemed to hold its breath. He could see it in their faces, the surprise, the curiosity, the awe. He wasn't just performing notes. He was telling a story that everyone could feel, even if they didn't know why. By the time he reached the climax of the piece, the entire room was silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a whisper. Every person was drawn into the music, absorbed by the emotion it carried. It was the same feeling he had at the festival, only more intimate, more intense. Because this time he could see the effect up close. When the final note lingered and faded into the quiet, the applause erupted, loud and genuine. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting encouragement. Some were crying quietly, moved by the depth of the music. Others laughed and smiled, caught up in the joy of the moment. He stood there, chest heaving, eyes shining, a mix of exhaustion and elation washing over him. He had done it again. As he stepped off stage, he realized something profound. Music was no longer just a part of him, it was a bridge to others, a way to connect, to communicate, to leave an imprint on the world. He didn't know where this journey would take him next. But he knew one thing for certain. He would never stop playing, never stop sharing, never stop believing in the power of his voice. And in that moment, as the cheers faded and the room returned to its usual hum, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The boy had never felt anything quite like it before. The thrill of performing, the eyes of the audience fixed on him, the way the music seemed to take on a life of its own. After the previous events, he knew that music was more than just a hobby. It was a language, a way to speak without words, a bridge that connected him to everyone who would listen. But this time something felt different. The crowd was larger, the space brighter, and the stakes somehow higher. He could see people shifting in their seats, chatting quietly, waiting for the next performer. Some seemed distracted, scrolling on their phones or glancing around, but he could also sense curiosity. There was a kind of energy in the room, a tension that made his chest tighten. He took a deep breath and reminded himself, this was just another opportunity, another chance to do what he loved. The music wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about sharing a piece of himself. As he stepped onto the stage. The bright lights made it hard to see faces clearly, but he didn't need to. He felt the presence of the audience, the quiet hum of anticipation, and he knew that every single person was there to see and hear something special. He adjusted the microphone, ran his fingers over the strings of his guitar, and let himself feel the music bubbling inside him. The first notes were gentle, soft, almost hesitant. He wanted to ease the audience into his world, to let them notice the care in his playing. The chords were simple, melodic, and carried the weight of countless hours spent practicing alone in a small apartment. At first, some people continued their quiet chatter, unsure if they were even listening, but slowly the notes began to pull them in. Something happened then, something magical. The music grew naturally, effortlessly, expanding with confidence. His fingers moved over the strings with precision and emotion, and his voice, soft at first, found strength and depth. Every note seemed to carry a story, a memory, a feeling that words could never capture. People started to stop talking, to lean forward, to notice. The rhythm, the melody, the emotion, it was impossible to ignore. He played with his whole heart, pouring every bit of passion, fear, and joy into the music. This was not a performance for show or applause. It was a conversation, a connection, an offering of his soul. And the audience responded without even realizing it. The chatter faded, heads turned toward him, eyes widened. Hearts began to follow the rhythm of the music as if it were their own heartbeat. He felt a moment of disbelief himself. Was this really happening? Was the music really carrying this much power? It wasn't the loudness or the speed that captivated them. It was the honesty, the truth behind each note. The quiet moments between the chords were as powerful as the loud ones, allowing the audience to breathe, to feel, to sink into the story he was telling without a single word. The boy looked out and noticed people holding their breath, leaning toward the stage as if trying to catch each note before it vanished. Even the skeptics, the ones who had rolled their eyes when he was announced, were sitting silently, captivated. Their expressions had changed. Surprise, curiosity, awe, and even a touch of disbelief were written across their faces. It was a moment he would never forget. As he continued, he became aware of how the music flowed through him. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was emotion, a tangible presence that moved through the air. The rhythm became like footsteps walking through a story, the melody like a river carrying memories, and his voice, though soft, became the guide for everyone in the room. He could feel the energy shift, a subtle change as the audience leaned closer. Silence replacing conversation, attention replacing distraction. He remembered all the times he had been told to stay quiet, to lower his expectations, to be practical. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the nights of practicing alone while everyone else slept, the moments of self-doubt when he wondered if he was wasting his time. And yet, in this room, with hundreds of eyes and ears on him, none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was this moment, this music, this connection. The pace of the music began to shift, slow and deliberate, each note stretching as if inviting the audience to lean in and listen even closer. The boy could see people closing their eyes, swaying gently, letting themselves be carried by the rhythm. The emotion was palpable. It was as if the music was speaking directly to their hearts. Some smiled, some teared up quietly, some simply sat in awe, unsure how to express what they were feeling. It was the first time he truly realized the power of music, not just to entertain, but to move people, to quiet their thoughts, to change their state of mind without a single word. He had never imagined his music could hold such authority, such presence, such effect. And yet here it was, surrounding him, filling the space. Touching everyone equally, he started to play with more confidence, more intensity, letting the music rise and fall like waves on a shore. Each chord was deliberate, each melody carefully woven, but it was also free, spontaneous, alive. The audience responded instinctively. Their breathing seemed to match the rhythm, their hearts synced with the beat, and the room itself seemed to vibrate with the sound. Some people whispered to each other, but their voices were soft, almost reverent, as if they didn't want to disturb the moment. Children stopped fidgeting, leaning closer to see the source of the sound. Elderly audience members held their hands together, eyes glistening. Even those who had come expecting nothing were now fully immersed, drawn in by something they could not explain but could clearly feel. The boy felt a sense of liberation as he continued. Every note was a piece of him, every chord a reflection of his journey, every melody a bridge connecting him to everyone listening. He realized that this was what he had been practicing for all those years, not recognition, not applause, not validation, but the ability to touch lives through the language of music. He glanced briefly at the stage lights, illuminating him in a soft glow, and then back at the audience. He could see their expressions changing with every phrase. Some were leaning forward in anticipation, some had tears in their eyes, some were simply sitting in stunned silence. It was as if the music had temporarily suspended time, drawing everyone into a shared moment of understanding and emotion. He didn't slow down. He didn't hold back. Even when his fingers ached and his voice threatened to falter, he pushed through, letting the music dictate the pace, the flow, the emotion. Each note was intentional yet natural, raw yet controlled, personal yet universal. He was telling his story, but it had become their story too. And then it happened, the moment he had been waiting for. The music built to a crescendo, powerful but not overwhelming, commanding but not harsh. It filled every corner of the room, resonating in the walls, in the floors, in the very air around them. The audience was silent, completely still, hanging on every note. Caught in the grip of something larger than themselves, he could feel their energy, their focus, their attention, and it gave him a new kind of strength. The music seemed to flow through him effortlessly now, as if it had a life of its own. He was no longer just playing, it was as though he had become part of the music, and the music had become part of everyone listening. In that moment, he realized something profound. The warnings, the doubts, the skepticism, they had all been irrelevant. Music was not something to be controlled or confined. It was alive, unpredictable, and unstoppable. And when shared with honesty and passion, it had the power to silence fear, doubt, and distraction. It had the power to unite a room, to command attention, to move hearts in ways words never could. The final notes lingered, hanging in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. For a moment, there was complete silence, so complete that you could almost hear your own heartbeat. And then, slowly, a murmur began, a ripple of sound that grew steadily into applause. Hands clapped, feet stomped, voices cheered, and the room erupted into appreciation. But it wasn't just applause, it was acknowledgement, recognition, connection. The boy stood there, chest heaving, eyes shining, overwhelmed by the response. People approached him afterward, some with tears, some with wide smiles, some simply nodding in quiet respect. Words were exchanged, but they felt secondary. The real communication had already happened through the music. Everyone in the room had shared a moment that could never be taken away. A moment that would linger in their memories long after the lights dimmed. He stepped off the stage, exhausted but exhilarated, feeling a quiet satisfaction he had never experienced before. This was more than a performance. It was proof of something he had always known but had never fully understood, that when you follow your passion, when you trust your voice, and when you pour your heart into what you love, it can move people in ways nothing else can. And as he walked backstage, the echo of the applause still ringing in his ears, he knew that this was only the beginning. The music was his voice, and the world was finally ready to listen. The boy could feel the energy of the room shifting. Every note he played seemed to reach further, touching hearts, stirring emotions, and capturing attention in a way he had never experienced before. The audience, which had started as a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and casual interest, was now completely absorbed. Conversations had ceased entirely. Phones were lowered, and eyes were fixed on him. Every person in the room seemed suspended in time, caught in the flow of the music. He didn't even notice the stage lights anymore. His focus was entirely on the music and the connection it had created. Each chord, each note, each pause carried weight. It was as if the room had become an extension of his mind, every listener a part of the story he was telling without saying a single word. He felt the music vibrating not only in the instruments and speakers, but in the very air around him. He began to play with more confidence, letting his emotions guide the rhythm and melody. The music rose and fell like waves, moving from soft, tender moments to powerful, commanding crescendos. He felt a strange clarity, as if he could see the story of his life unfolding with every note, the hours of practice in a cramped apartment, the nights when the world seemed indifferent, the small victories that no one noticed. It was all there, woven into the music, and the audience was experiencing it with him. As the music built toward its peak, he noticed subtle reactions from the crowd. A mother held her child closer, her eyes glistening. A man near the back, who had seemed disinterested at first, now had his head tilted and his hand over his heart. Even the skeptical festival coordinators, who had been quietly watching from the side, looked astonished. Some leaned forward, unable to believe the power of what they were witnessing. Others simply sat in quiet amazement, overwhelmed by the raw emotion filling the room. He could feel the music guiding him, almost as if it had a life of its own. It wasn't just about playing notes correctly anymore. It was about telling a story that everyone could feel, no matter their age, background, or experience. Each sound was deliberate yet free, controlled yet spontaneous, personal yet universal. It was a language that didn't require translation, a conversation that bypassed words and spoke directly to hearts. The boy noticed a few people in the front rows closing their eyes, leaning into the melody as if trying to absorb every vibration. Others sat rigidly, holding their breath, fully immersed in the moment. The air felt charged, electric, and heavy with emotion. It was as if the music had cast a spell, silencing doubt, distraction, and even disbelief. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sync with the rhythm he was creating. An unspoken harmony between performer and audience. He began to improvise, letting intuition take over, trusting the flow of the music. The notes swirled and intertwined, creating layers of sound that were both complex and simple. There was a power in the performance now that went beyond skill. It was pure emotion, raw and undeniable. He could sense the effect it was having, the way people were being drawn into his world, experiencing it alongside him. As the music reached a particularly powerful moment, he looked out at the audience and noticed a profound silence that went beyond mere quiet. This was not just the absence of noise, it was full attention, complete presence. Every single person from the front row to the back was utterly captivated. Even those who had been restless, whispering, or skeptical at the start were now holding still, hanging on every note. The music had silenced the entire room, not with volume or force, but with connection, emotion, and truth. It was the first time he truly realized the weight of his talent. Not the technical skill, not the applause, not the recognition, but the ability to reach people in a way that left them moved, changed, and deeply affected. The music had become more than a performance. It had become an experience, a shared moment of vulnerability and emotion. The audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling, living, and breathing the music alongside him. He felt a surge of courage as he continued to play. Each note was a declaration of everything he had endured, every doubt he had overcome, every night spent practicing alone when the world seemed indifferent. The music had become a statement, a refusal to be silenced, a proof of perseverance, and a celebration of passion. He wasn't just performing, he was sharing his story. And the audience was responding with an intensity he had never imagined. He glanced briefly at the festival coordinators, who had warned him to stay quiet, to follow the rules, to not get carried away. Their faces reflected astonishment, disbelief, and admiration. For the first time, it seemed that they understood. His music had transcended instructions and limitations. It was no longer about keeping quiet, it was about being heard, being felt, and being seen. And in that moment, he knew he had achieved exactly what he had set out to do. The boy's playing became even more expressive, each chord carrying layers of emotion. He felt the music responding to him as much as he was responding to the music. It was a dance between his hands, his heart, and the instruments, flowing freely, effortlessly. The audience's silence encouraged him, gave him strength, and allowed him to reach new heights. Every note seemed to echo in the room, lingering in the air long after it was played. At one point, he allowed a pause, a gentle moment of quiet, letting the tension and emotion hang in the space. He could see the audience leaning forward, eyes wide, hearts racing. The silence wasn't awkward. It was filled with anticipation, with understanding, with the realization that they were experiencing something extraordinary. That quiet moment amplified the music that followed, making every sound even more powerful, more captivating, more alive. The boy poured himself completely into the final section of the performance. The music swelled, powerful yet delicate, commanding yet intimate. The audience was completely silent, every person fully present, every ear attuned to every subtle change in tone and rhythm. He could feel the collective heartbeat of the room, feel the energy of hundreds of people flowing toward him and merging with the sound he was creating. Then, the final note rang out. It lingered, suspended in the air, stretching for a moment longer than he expected. The room remained silent, as if nobody dared to break the spell. For a brief, magical moment, it was as if the world had stopped, leaving only the boy and his music. And then, slowly, the realization hit: he had done it. He had not only performed, he had moved, captivated, and silenced an entire crowd. The applause began softly at first, then grew steadily, swelling into a roar of admiration, respect, and awe. People stood, clapped, cheered, and some even shouted in excitement. But it wasn't just loudness, it was heartfelt, genuine recognition of the courage, talent, and emotion he had shared. The boy stood on stage, chest heaving, heart racing, tears threatening to spill over, and for the first time, he truly understood the impact of his music. He stepped off the stage, still trembling from the intensity of the performance. Backstage, people surrounded him, offering congratulations, shaking his hand, smiling, and sometimes just standing silently, moved by what they had experienced. The boy felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, a sense of fulfillment that was hard to put into words. He had given everything he had, and the audience had responded in a way that was beyond anything he had imagined. Even the skeptical coordinators came over, this time unable to hide their amazement. "We underestimated you," one said quietly, almost in awe. That was incredible." The boy nodded, smiling, understanding that recognition wasn't just about praise, it was about proving something to himself, about knowing that following his passion, trusting his instincts, and pouring his heart into the music had been worth it. After the applause died down and the crowd slowly began to leave, he lingered on the stage, soaking in the silence, the echoes of his performance and the lingering energy of the audience. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place. Music was his voice, his story, and his connection to the world. And for the first time, he had truly felt the power of that voice, the strength of that story, and the depth of that connection. He knew that this moment would stay with him forever, a memory of triumph, courage, and the undeniable impact of following one's passion. It wasn't about fame, applause, or recognition. It was about truth, honesty, and the ability to move people with something that came straight from the heart. And in that moment, the boy felt a sense of peace, pride, and determination that nothing could shake. After the performance, the boy stepped off the stage, his legs trembling and his heart still racing from the intensity of what had just happened. The roar of the crowd still echoed in his ears, and the memory of their silent awe lingered like a warm glow. He walked through the backstage area where people were clapping, smiling, and offering congratulations. Some were fellow musicians, some were event organizers, and some were complete strangers who had been deeply moved. Every person he passed seemed genuinely grateful for what he had shared, and the feeling settled in his chest like a quiet kind of pride. He had never imagined that music could have this effect. He had always loved it, always felt it, but never truly understood how powerful it could be until that moment. It was more than just notes or rhythm. It was connection. It was a bridge between him and everyone who had been listening, a way of communicating without words, a language that touched hearts directly. And for the first time he realized that his passion, his dedication, his courage to play even when others doubted him had created something remarkable. People came up to him one by one. Some smiled, clapped him on the shoulder, and said things like, "That was incredible. I've never felt anything like it." Others were quieter, simply nodding or looking him in the eyes, and he could tell they had been profoundly affected. There were tears, laughter, wide-eyed astonishment, and even moments where people didn't speak at all, letting their silence honor the moment. The boy felt overwhelmed, but in the best way possible. It was humbling to know that something so personal, his music, his expression, could move so many people at once. A few festival organizers approached, still wide-eyed and slightly speechless. One of them finally managed to say, "We thought you might play well, but we didn't expect." That was extraordinary. The boy smiled quietly. He didn't need any more praise than the reactions he had already seen and felt. He knew that the true reward wasn't in the words or applause, it was in the connection, the shared experience. The way people had been completely present in the moment with him. Journalists and bloggers approached, eager to interview him, asking questions about his journey, his inspiration, and his dreams. He answered simply, honestly, without exaggeration. He talked about the long hours practicing alone in a small, cramped apartment, the moments of doubt when he wondered if anyone would ever care about his music, the little victories no one else noticed, and the joy he felt when he finally realized that music wasn't just sound, it was life itself. Every word he spoke seemed to resonate with the listeners, and he could see that they understood. Even the other performers, some of whom had initially been skeptical, came over to shake his hand, offer praise, and share encouragement. Some said things like, "You inspired me today," or "I've been playing for years, but I've never seen anything like that." Others simply smiled and nodded, letting their silence convey the respect and admiration they felt. It was clear that the boy had not only captivated the audience, but had also earned the respect of his peers after the initial excitement settled. He found a quiet corner backstage to reflect on everything that had happened. The adrenaline was still rushing, but there was also a calm, profound sense of accomplishment. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the nights of practicing when everyone else slept, the encouragement from a few people who had believed in him, the skepticism he had faced, the constant doubts from others and even from himself. And he realized that every single step had mattered. Every challenge, every small victory, every moment of perseverance had built him into the musician he had become. He remembered the early days when he had played in the quiet courtyard behind his apartment, with only the birds, stray cats, and a few neighbors listening. Back then, he had felt invisible, unsure if anyone would ever care about what he was doing. But those small moments had been important. They had taught him patience, resilience, and the joy of creating something purely for the love of it. Now, standing after his biggest performance yet, he could see how those early experiences had shaped him, prepared him for this very moment. In the days that followed, the impact of his performance continued to grow. People talked about him everywhere, on the streets, in shops, at school, and online. Some called him a prodigy, some said he was a young talent to watch, and others simply described him as inspiring. But what mattered most to him wasn't the titles or recognition. It was knowing that his music had touched people, that it had moved them in ways they couldn't always describe, and that it had created a shared experience that would stay with them long after the performance ended. Opportunities began to appear. Invitations to perform at other events, offers to collaborate with more experienced musicians, and chances to learn from mentors who recognized his talent. While the boy felt excited about these possibilities, he also felt a quiet determination. He didn't want to rush, didn't want to be swept up by fame or expectation. He wanted to continue growing, learning, and sharing his music in a way that was honest and true to himself. One afternoon, he visited the small community center where he had first begun learning music. The same peeling posters lined the walls, the same worn piano sat in the corner, and everything felt familiar yet different. He realized how far he had come, and a deep sense of gratitude filled him. The boy who had once been told to stay quiet, to be practical, to focus on something realistic, had now proven that following one's passion could create something extraordinary. And he wanted to honor that journey by continuing to grow, share, and inspire others. He began to teach some of the younger children who came to the community center. He showed them that music wasn't just about skill or talent, it was about expressing yourself, sharing your feelings, and connecting with others. He encouraged them to play freely, to make mistakes, to explore sounds and rhythms, and to find joy in the process. And as he taught, he noticed something remarkable. Some of the children were just like he had been, curious, passionate, and eager to share their music with the world. Helping them, guiding them, and watching their excitement grow became another source of fulfillment for him. Despite all the recognition and opportunities, he remained humble. He remembered the nights of solitude, the small victories, and the quiet moments of practice. He understood that true success wasn't just about applause or attention. It was about staying true to yourself, nurturing your passion, and sharing it with the world. And that realization gave him a sense of peace and clarity that nothing else could provide. Months later, at another performance, he returned to a stage similar to the one where he had first silenced the crowd. This time, he felt calm and centered, confident in his ability to share his music authentically. As he played, he noticed familiar reactions, the quiet attentiveness, the smiles, the way people leaned in to listen. But he also saw new faces, young and old, drawn by word of mouth, eager to experience the music he had created. And once again, he felt the profound connection that comes when music transcends words, expectations, and barriers. The applause at the end of that performance was just as strong as the first, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just about recognition, it was about knowing that he had touched lives, inspired others, and continued to follow the path he had chosen. People came up to him afterward, some with tears in their eyes, some with wide smiles, and others simply shaking his hand, speechless. And for the boy, all of it was confirmation that his journey was meaningful, that his dedication and courage had made a difference. Looking back on everything he had experienced, he realized that the lessons were more important than the accolades. He had learned that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about facing fear, doubt, and skepticism and continuing to pursue what matters to you. He had learned that passion is powerful when combined with perseverance, and that the act of sharing your heart with the world can create profound connections. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the greatest triumph comes not from following rules or expectations, but from trusting your own voice. The boy continued to grow as a musician, performer, and teacher. He never stopped practicing, never stopped exploring new melodies, rhythms, and sounds. He never stopped listening to the world, finding inspiration in everyday life, the sound of rain, the laughter of children, the quiet hum of a city at night. And he never stopped sharing his music with others, knowing that each performance, each note, each melody had the potential to move someone in ways words never could. Through it all, he remained grounded, remembering where he had come from: the small apartment, the quiet courtyard, the early nights of practice, the skepticism of others. And he carried with him the understanding that his journey was about more than fame or recognition. It was about connection, expression, and the power of music to touch hearts and inspire others to follow their own passions. Years later, when people spoke about him, they didn't just speak about a talented musician, they spoke about someone who had courage, someone who had followed his heart, and someone who had shown the world that being true to yourself could create extraordinary moments. And the boy, now grown, continued to play, teach, and inspire, never forgetting the first moment when his music had silenced an entire crowd, and the lesson it had taught him: